At first glance, visitors would not necessarily know this scarred but green and open pastoral land once hosted an abundance of human activity over a century ago as prairie soldiers prepared to fight in the Great War to defeat the Central Powers. This is Camp Hughes, a former Canadian military training camp located approximately 185 kilometers west of Winnipeg and 35 kilometers east of Brandon. From 1909 to 1934, Camp Hughes accommodated military training camps at this site. During the Great War years from 1914 to 1918, over 38,000 soldiers trained here. At its peak, it was considered Manitoba's second largest city after Winnipeg by population. The site encompasses a relatively intact battlefield trench system, the remains of building foundations, and former rifle and grenade ranges created for military training. It is one of the few existing examples of trench warfare training in Canada.
Camp Hughes today is a National Historic Site, and you realize that the soldiers who trained at Camp Hughes in 1915 and 16, many of them were the same ones who helped capture Vimy Ridge.
Designated a Provincial Heritage Site in 1994 and a National Historic Site in 2011, the now decommissioned 10-square-mile Camp Hughes has a story. The forerunner to Camp Hughes, known as Camp Sewell, was established in 1909. In the fall that year, the No. 10 Militia District Commander, Colonel Sam Steele, the prototypical Mountie, recommended a suitable training area for the No. 10 Military District soldiers. No. 10 District comprised Manitoba and Saskatchewan infantry, cavalry, and artillery troops. The training location was the Spruce Wood Forest Reserve, between the Canadian Pacific Railroad to the north and the Douglas Marsh to the south.
Under a half an inch of topsoil, it was sand. Farmers couldn't do much with it, so they didn't settle there. So they had this vast tract of land. That was all their training area.
In 1910, the first militia training camp at this newly established site was set up near a railway siding known as Sewell, with tent lines stretching eastward. The No. 10 Detachment of the Canadian Ordnance Corps helped lay out the camp and assembled sufficient stores to enable the militia training to happen. Many of the 1,471 militia soldiers attending training that year were transported to Camp Sewell by train.
The whole idea of transporting soldiers from the northwest corner of Saskatchewan by train to go to Camp Hughes, and all these soldiers being asked to converge in June, must have been a nightmare for the transport officers of the Service Corps.
The Winnipeg-based No. 11 Service Company, Canadian Army Service Corps, or CASC, was formed in 1907 under the guidance of veteran logistics officer Major Herbert Swinford. The growth of these militia camps undoubtedly influenced the establishment of No. 18 Service Company in 1912 under the command of Major Armand Corelli. In civilian life, Corelli was the clerk of the Manitoba Legislature and also a veteran of the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. The authorized establishment for the Service Corps companies at that time was 6 officers, 100 men, and 86 horses with transport wagons. However, support requirements grew significantly over the next few years as each summer camp was larger than the previous year. In 1913, the first historical use of motor transport by the Canadian Army Service Corps in Winnipeg occurred when No. 18 Service Company rented 2 trucks to transport feed to the hundreds of horses throughout the camp.
There was a natural call-out for soldiers that had special skills. They needed mechanical drivers, mechanics, because they were slowly converging and becoming motor-driven vehicles rather than horse-driven. They needed blacksmiths, they needed butchers, they needed bakers, they needed trained cooks. They went through every community in Western Canada to recruit these people. They gave them almost the equivalent ranks of sergeants. They were getting probably 60, 70 cents more a day.
In 1914, over 6,600 men and 3,500 horses concentrated at Camp Sewell in what was the final peacetime camp. By this time, the camp was being supported by 11 Service Company from Winnipeg under command of Captain G.F.C. Poussette, 18 Service Company from St. James, and No. 20 Service Company from Regina under the command of Major Henry Laird. Laird had previous military experience with the Queen's Own Rifles and later became a Canadian senator. In 1915, with the Great War now underway, the number of soldiers being trained at Camp Sewell was expected to double to about 15,000. Engineers needed to create a better water system. Improvements were made to existing buildings. New buildings were erected, and an asphalt road was constructed to accommodate the main street of Camp Hughes. By 1916, the focus on trench warfare in Europe changed the training emphasis toward infantry. This proved challenging for the service companies to support the 29 infantry battalions in camp over the summer that year. As each infantry battalion comprised up to 1,000 men, the entire summer was hectic. The Sewell Station's name was changed to Hughes in 1916 to honor Colonel Sir Sam Hughes, who was the Minister of Militia and Defense at the time. The camp thereafter came to be known as Camp Hughes.
Sam Hughes' brother, John, he came to inspect the whole camp. So they paraded them all out on that section of sand northwest of the camp. 30,000, they said, was there on the field. And there was the Strathconas, and then the Fort Garrys, and then the Scottish regiments, and then the common run-of-the-mill infantry.
One soldier from the 128th Moose Jaw Battalion, Private Laurence Dunbar Cunningham, from Hazenmore, Saskatchewan, wrote letters home to describe life at Camp Hughes.
June 7th, 1916. Dear Teddy, it is raining off and on all the time. It rained pretty hard just before dinner, but it is nice when the sun shines between times. We are sleeping cold these nights, but not enough to hurt us. I just have one blanket, one fly over me and my oil sheet, and the other blanket for a fly under me. I done very poor shooting. I got, I suppose, 20% of the points I shot for, and no more, but I should worry. I will go out every chance I get to shoot and run chances on getting at some other job besides fighting in the trenches when I get to the front, if ever. We have great times, nights playing leapfrog and wrestling and boxing around here like we were crazy. There is always some music very nearly from 5:30 a.m. till 10:15 p.m., and it is surely great.
We cannot fight, we cannot shoot.
I went to the YMCA last night and got a book to read, but I know that I will never get time to read it, so I will just take it back. As ever, your loving son, Laurie.
With the large and growing population in camp, each of the 3 service companies had to share in the general duties. This included transporting supplies and tons of food daily from the warehouses to the camps with both trucks and horses and wagons. The Canadian Army Service Corps Transport Section received 12 trucks of varying makes and 6 touring cars. 4 of the trucks had to have bodies built onto the chassis. The burgeoning demand for camp training support and the anticipation of 30,000 troops converging on the camp in 1916 required the No. 1 Overseas Training Depot, or OTD, to move its location to Camp Hughes. The No. 1 OTD's role was to recruit support troops from across Canada. The commanding officer of 1 OTD was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Laird. Between September 1915 and May 1918, No. 1 OTD trained 16 reinforcement service support drafts for overseas service, which amounted to 37 officers and 2,119 other ranks, no small contribution to the war effort. Basic military training encompassed musketry, including loading and unloading a weapon and its use, drilling, with and without arms, including long route marches. Signaling, to become proficient with flags at sending and receiving in semaphore. machine gun training on Lewis machine guns, and bayonet training. The overall service support activity accomplished during the various training camps that year was impressive. The camp bakery produced 25,000 loaves of bread daily. Service company troops delivered and processed 70 tons of supplies daily and issued up to 32,000 daily rations. The postal group processed 1 million letters. The pay group assisted with wages distribution and handled 30-unit canteen audits. Veterinarian staff looked after 3,000 horses passing through and 400 in camp, with only 12 animal deaths. Dental staff performed 27,162 operations. A medical staff of over 300 persons, including 8 nursing sisters, admitted 3,815 soldiers to a 350-bed hospital with 11 deaths. And the provost, known as military police, returned 498 absent without leave, or AWOL, soldiers and deserters to camp. The main camp along the tracks included a railway station and platform for arrivals and departures, administrative offices, 2 churches, a prison, post office, and an in-ground swimming pool described as the largest in Western Canada. On the east edge of the camp was an area allocated to civilian concessions known as the Midway. It comprised 6 movie theaters, a watch repair shop, a tobacconist, a tailor shop, a bookstore, 2 banks, a camp newspaper, and a photographic studio. A 10-kilometer network of trenches along with grenade and rifle ranges were constructed to the south of the main camp area. The trenches were meant to replicate the conditions that troops would encounter on arrival at European battlefields. However, 24 hours in a training trench could not possibly replicate what these soldiers were about to face on the battlefield. This included frequent artillery shelling, miserable weather, rats, trench foot from standing in water, cholera, typhus, dysentery, flies, and lice.
Dear Mother, I had my first digging of trenches the other day. 34 of us dug a trench about 17 rods long, 4 feet wide at the top, 3 feet at the bottom, and 5 feet deep. We fell in at 8 a.m. and marched a mile. We started to dig and had it done long before 4 p.m. We've been warned for overseas, but still I won't give up till I see us loaded that we won't get home for harvest. I guess it is because I want to come. Well, good night, Mother dear. As ever, your loving son, Laurie.
Units attending camp had to demonstrate an acceptable level of proficiency before being sent overseas. Once considered sufficiently trained, units were shipped out by train to the East Coast, where they embarked on ships like the RMS Olympic, sister ship to the RMS Titanic. The ship made 10 round trips from Liverpool to Halifax between March and December 1916. In 1917, Camp Hughes was used less for training as the Great War began to wind down. However, it continued to serve as a military and militia training facility during the interwar years until 1934, when it was dismantled as an unemployment relief Depression-era work project. Military training relocated to a new camp south of Camp Hughes at Canadian Forces Base Shilo, where military training is still conducted to this day. Many of those who had trained for war at Camp Hughes were involved in well-known battles in Europe, such as Ypres, Vimy, Hill 70, Lens, Passchendaele, Amiens, Arras, the Somme, and Cambrai. By November 1918, the Allies were victorious in the Great War, but there were almost 66,000 Canadians dead, 172,000 wounded, 3,800 prisoners of war, and 9,000 afflicted with shell shock, the equivalent of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some came home after the war broken. Most tried to bury the devastating experiences of war in their memory. The 128th Battalion, suffered 91.5% casualties. Private Bronwen Cunningham from D Company saw action in several battles. Here are Laurie's thoughts at 80.
The 6th of July, 1917. We jumped over the top, but for some good fortune, I was asked to be on the gas guard that 24 hours at Battalion or Company headquarters, so maybe my life was saved again. I took up a position in Lens 18 hours after the advance, and the barbed wire was filled with our dead hanging on it. The area smelled of something awful. Between Vimy and Passchendaele area, we went over the top in a drenching rain on October 26th or thereabouts. I worked on that front for 10 days, carrying out wounded and carrying iron posts and barbed wire. Over the top was July 6th, 1918, when the mounted infantry let off at daylight south of Amiens. There was not one horse that did not get shot down before it got to the first machine gun. I was in the noonday advance and had direct machine gun fire turned on me twice, but was not hit. One of my best friends was killed from shrapnel, struck in the groin. His heart was very weak. One night at Passchendaele, 4 of us were sleeping in 2 shell holes about 15 feet apart. A shell came and blew Taylor and the other boy right out of the shell hole and killed them both. I took their identification tags from their necks and put them back in the shell hole and covered them over. The next advance was September 2nd, 1918, south of Arras, along the Cambrai-Arras Road. We advanced 3.5 miles with very heavy casualties. I was dressing the boy, shot through the abdomen and out his back. A bullet went through my right hand, through the joint of the second finger, and cut the cord of my third finger and broke the bone between the palm and the joint of my little finger. I got on top of the bus, the happiest man in the world, and threw my helmet away and got to Boulogne to a hospital. I was in Liverpool on the 11th of November, Armistice Day. The streets were so crowded that you could only move with the crowd.
Following the Great War, Bronwen Cunningham became a strong advocate for peace and a committed pacifist. He marched or walked for peace in the 1960s and 70s carrying his own handmade placard. He died in 1978 at age 87. All the First World War veterans are long departed now, but we owe them, and all other Canadian War veterans, a debt of gratitude for keeping Canada free of foreign oppression. To those who died or were wounded in war, to other veterans who have served Canada for so much of their adult lives, to military members currently deployed around the world. However small the acknowledgement, we can only say, thank you for your service.
I want to go home. I want to go home. Machine guns may rattle and cannons may roar. I don't want to go to the front anymore. Take me out of the sea where the enemy can't get at me. Oh my, I don't want to die. I want to go home. Oh, call out the army and the navy. Call out your rank and file. Call out the good old territorials and the colonials too. They'll face the music with a smile. Where are the boys of the old brigade that set old England free? Send out my mother, my sister or my brother. but for God's sake, don't send me.